You're listening to the Scaling Culture podcast, where we sit down with thought leaders who share their experiences building incredible workplace cultures. Our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Thorp, Chief Learning Officer at Quantum Connections. Dr. Thorp is a renowned expert in relational competency with a focus on neuro and quantum social sciences. With 25 years of service in the United States Navy as a naval aviator and flight instructor, and later corporate leadership roles at JPMorgan Chase and Company, Dr. Thorp brings a unique blend of military discipline, corporate insight, and educational expertise. In this episode of Scaling Culture, Ron and Dr. Thorp discuss how leaders can foster psychological safety in their teams to combat burnout and disengagement, the power of mirroring in leadership communication and its role in building understanding, how affirmations can transform workplace interactions, boosting morale and productivity, insights into the Safe Conversations Dialogue framework and how it helps resolve conflicts without judgment, and how the critical role relational competency plays in leadership, team success, and employee retention.
Welcome to another episode of the Scaling Culture podcast. I'm your host, Ron Lovett, and today we have Jonathan Thorp, the Quantum Connection Chief Learning Officer out of Dallas, Texas. Jonathan, how you doing?
Good morning, Ron. I'm well. How are you, sir?
Very good. It's the end of the summer. So I've got 3 kids under the age of 7, and we spend our summers about 45 minutes from Halifax in a place called Chester, Nova Scotia. And so it's a summer home. We're very lucky to have it, and we kind of miss it when we go down there. And then as it gets close to the time, we do miss the city, and it's time to come back. I think this morning all 3 children were served with restraining orders.
I think most parents look forward to the fall for a couple of reasons, but the advent of school is not always a bad thing.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that routine, the children also miss the routine, right? Which is nice to have. Well, enough about parenting and children. Let's get into this. I was just saying before we kicked off, you've got a really interesting background. And so before you get into your background, John, because I do think for context, to have a deeper dive in your background would be helpful to the listeners. But I'm curious from a communication standpoint. I want you to go back in time, and I want you to think about the first time that you can remember that you had a tough conversation with someone that it didn't land well, and then what you learned from that. So take a moment, think of like when you had a tough discussion with someone that you thought you were going to get them motivated to go left, and it just didn't land well, and bring us back to that moment.
Oh, gosh. It's probably difficult to pick one because there are probably 1,000.
Sure.
But if I were paying attention, I would go back 25 years and take any of a handful of conversations in an airplane when I was either flying with somebody more senior or perhaps somebody junior to me, and something was said in the cockpit that you thought was fairly intuitive, that this should pretty much be obvious on its own merits. And when the other person doesn't understand, you have no time to kind of sit in this ambiguous cloud of not knowing and not understanding. And the first time it happened, I probably misunderstood somebody I was flying with and didn't say anything. And we landed and we're in a debrief. And he finally followed up with me and said, "What were you thinking? What were you doing?" And I explained to him, and he's like, "That's totally not what we were going for. That's not what we were briefed to do." And I learned, the hard way, took my lumps and said, that's on me. I assumed that I understood you. And I now know you can't spend a lot of time stuck in ambiguity. You have to clarify. And that's probably a lesson I've hung on to for the last 30 years.
That's really interesting. So we had 2 of our leaders go to West Point this year. And one of the things they came back with was kind of what I'll call exactly what you're saying, like a communication upgrade. It's not about being understood. It's about ensuring you're 100% not misunderstood. And that's what you're talking about. And I love that type of, and I think it's interesting because when I heard our folks come back with that, I thought, I'm good on one side of that, but not on the other. And what I mean by that is if you communicate with me, I'll typically will say, unless I'm crystal clear or believe I'm crystal clear, I will say, let me play that back to you. But what I don't do is I'm communicating, ensure that you play it back to me. That's really interesting. So bring us back to, you've got a very diverse career. Just walk the listeners through kind of your overall career, and then I might pepper some questions in with as we go along in your journey.
Sure. Your description, interesting. Probably another way to say wandering or apparently haphazard. I've done a lot of things, and I've been fortunate to at least have paid attention along the way, and I've learned a great deal. I spent a little over 20 years in the Navy as an aviator, flying around the world and learning how dramatically varied the world's problems are, and just to see things not just from one nation, one culture, but from a variety of national perspectives. That was really important for me. I finished up my time in the Navy and went on to financial services because I happened to benefit from a fantastic financial advisor when I was in the service. I couldn't take care of my own affairs and leaned on him and fell in love with that profession and joined it. And actually, after another 20 years in that career, got into academics, went back to school, spent a lot of time focusing on people, relationships, and communication. And I do that for a living today.
Jonathan, go back. Why did you like wealth management? That's what it was, wealth management, right? Why did you like that so much?
I liked it because too often the solutions in that industry are masked or disguised within jargon and a lot of false sophistication that most people don't need. And it probably discourages more people from seeking advice and professional help. And so I worked to kind of combat that and try to simplify solutions and the communication around wealth management. And I found that people were receptive and that they would do things that were in their best interest if they just understood them. And so that became kind of fun for me.
So it sounds like there was an opportunity for you to be a better communicator, to really get to what people were, their fears, their et cetera. It sounds like you were really using communication skills to help you there.
I was blessed and was exposed to a couple of excellent communicators early in my career. And I endeavored to try to follow in their footsteps and to take on some of their attributes and their behaviors, and discovered that the world suffers from way too few excellent communicators. And if there's one thing to pursue, that's an outstanding thing to aspire to be.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. So walk us through, what are some of the key things early days that were kind of communication 101 that maybe you took for granted?
Gosh, again, this is a list of the mistakes that I've made and learned probably the hard way through lumps on the head. I think one of the first mistakes that I learned was I worked really hard to be understood. And I made it a priority to help other people understand where I was coming from, what my motivations were, what were my ambitions. And I think eventually I discovered that far more important is understanding someone else first, rather than placing yourself and your agenda first in line. And I think that was difficult to hear because I was raised in a performance culture, a high performance culture, and wanted to deliver and achieve and demonstrate results. And so eventually I was lucky enough to learn that, hey, there are other things that matter maybe as much or maybe even more, like process improvement and lessons learned, and maybe getting past best practices and instead hang your hat on better practices.
Yeah, really interesting. I was just thinking to a conversation I had last week with a potential political someone who's running for mayor, and I was having a discussion with this individual, and I think back to my experience dealing with politicians in general. And a friend of mine, John Risley, always states, you never have a bad meeting with a politician, which is really annoying because it's so true. And you leave every meeting like, I had a great meeting with so and so, and like nothing's going to happen here.
Did they
And
mean it as a compliment or not?
yeah, well, no, he was saying like, just know that you're going to leave a meeting with a politician, and 99% of the time, you're going to think it was a great meeting and nothing's going to happen. And the best politicians, which do kind of what I think you're talking about, well, as far as a process, so you get to understand what someone's position is, what their concerns are, but then you bring them into, look, Jonathan, that's great. Here's what my concerns, here's where my perspective is. Help me solve for this with what you want to do. And here's what I have to deal with. And so there's this that should come in. I think there is it needs to live there, even as a CEO. Look, that's really interesting advice. That's great perspective. Let me give you mine, and then let's talk about how we mash those together. What are your thoughts on that? Or is that, what are your comments?
Yeah, that's the shift. That's the shift that comes with maturity and experience and wisdom, is that you move away from your own agenda without totally forsaking your agenda. And I think that's probably another lesson that I learned. Obviously seek to understand before you want to be understood, but also don't hide your own agenda away. I think for a
Right.
number of years, I showed up and I was ready to help and assist, uh, at the exclusion of the things that I needed to perform and achieve also. And after a while, people started to wonder. They said, "Well, what does this guy really need and want? Because I don't. It's not apparent." And then it becomes suspicious that all you want is someone else's success. That looks a little bit
Mm.
odd. And I learned over time that it's okay to promote your agenda. And what you just suggested was so true, is that is there a way to promote and learn your agenda at the same time that I find ways to enhance my agenda and pursue the win-win?
Yeah, absolutely. Because otherwise, there is distrust. I agree. That it's like, okay, Ron's not sharing anything. He's just listening and nodding, and what's he up to? What's he thinking? And there is division with that type of distrust, I think, too. So go back to, sorry, after wealth management, then where did you head?
After wealth management, I kind of added responsibility over time, and before long was in a training organization within wealth management, and discovered I loved the light bulb moment when an audience would say, "I now get it because it's something you helped us practice or learn or try." And so that kind of lit a fire in me to kind of stay in adult learning and try to learn as much as I could, pattern some of the things I do after people that I've learned from. And that adult learning career took me into a couple of graduate schools where I now teach and remain committed to that light bulb moment for people.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Let's dive into some of these strategies. Maybe these are things you're teaching, but one in particular, which you talk about, which is mirroring. I have had a hard time with mirroring. I find I don't, and maybe I'm not doing it right. So I'm really curious to hear your position on this. I tend to label versus mirror. It feels more natural to me. Walk us through. How do you mirror properly? How do you get it right?
Here's what I'd say to mirroring. Mirroring or echoing or parroting is a phrase that's been co-opted in the adult learning community. A lot of people are trying it. The challenge with mirroring is a lot of people stop at step one and never take it all the way to step two and step three. So one of the things we teach is kind of a three-dimensional mirroring technique with depth. Now, here's the opposite. The opposite is somebody says something in a conversation and you try to mirror because you've heard mirroring's a good thing. And so they say, "This is a really big project and our deadline is going to be October." And you say, "Got it. Deadline's October and this is a very big project." And the conversation moves on. And here the person thinks, "Well, I've mirrored the thought. They've heard me say it." And they stop and they move on. The problem is something you mentioned earlier is that I don't know if they got everything they needed to or if I communicated everything I needed to. So here's what I do instead. Don't just mirror. And by mirror, I mean you can either kind of go for a verbatim read back, you can paraphrase if that's a little more natural for you. Your expression was label. So sample what you've heard and then actually try to offer it back to the person as best you heard the salient points, the details, the gist of what was said. But don't stop there. Step two is asking, "Did I get it?" And it's an
Hmm.
accuracy check. So first I mirror, but then I say, "Do I have it? Did I hear you? Did I get it?" Some version of that to actually insert an accuracy check. At that point, the speaker can then clarify or they can agree and say, "No, you've got amazing powers of listening. You heard everything." That's just step two, though. Step three might be the most important step in a mirroring sequence. And to that, I would say, ask the question, is there more? And that's a curiosity stem. So somebody shares something with you, you mirror it back. You ask the accuracy question, which is, did I get it? And then, depending on the response, finish by saying, is there more? And it's such a clear, conspicuous signal that says, I am interested in you and your message and making sure that I've got it all. And if you have other things you wanted to share, this is a safe place. Go for it. And I think that's what I would offer in terms of mirroring is that three-step, three-dimensional approach rather than just being the parrot on the pirate's shoulder, spitting back what you heard.
So it's funny, and the first time I heard about mirroring was through Chris Voss, right? Reading his book and watched the master class, and as I'm listening, I think mirroring is a fantastic technique to clarify, and then what you're adding is exploration on top of that, right? Curiosity and
That's right.
exploration. I found when Chris was positioning it, and again, maybe I misunderstood. It was kind of the example you gave. So it was like, it was, well, sorry, it was positioned I thought through Chris were more of a relationship building than a clarification tool, which is what you're using it for, right? Which I like it as a clarifying tool, not as a, so me saying, you know, so you say I've got this project and I'm under the deadline. It's really stressful. And I say, wow, really stressful. And then it's like silence. And it's like, okay, who's going to say something now? What are we going to do from here? Because if you don't say something, I don't know what to do. Versus like, sounds like, you know, this is really causing you some stress. And maybe it's even keeping you up at night. Like that's more relationship building than clarification either in some cases.
Not exclusively. And my example happened to be workplace and task oriented, but it absolutely doesn't have to be. In any conversation, a personal relationship or a professional relationship, dropping in mirroring is sometimes the first step or the first technique people can try to deepen a relationship. And it's fun to watch people do this for the first time because the reactions are so surprised. Most people don't expect to be asked, did I get it? And most people don't expect to be asked, is there more? And so in personal relationships, which we coach all the time, mirroring is a perfect way to, in a semi-safe way, be able to open up this relationship space to say, hey, this is going to be a place where we can actually expose some vulnerability and actually risk judgment, which we certainly want to avoid,
Yeah.
and replace that with acceptance. And I think the mirroring kind of makes a safe place in the conversation for people to feel like, hey, I'm being asked to clarify and asked to go deeper with that curiosity stem.
Okay, I'm going to give you an example and I want you to mirror me. I want to see this in a personal side, not business side. Okay, so yesterday I had a really challenging day with my son. He seems to get stuck on small little items that, you know, his sister put on his life jacket and he went wild. We couldn't calm him down. It was embarrassing. There were some other people there. We didn't really know how to deal with the situation.
So, Ron, I appreciate you sharing that. What I heard was that yesterday was a pretty tough day in a space where your son had an opportunity to perhaps share or borrow or hand off a life jacket became fairly traumatic. And it left you in a situation where you thought, man, there's a lot of energy here in the situation. And I was hoping that things could be a little more controlled. Uh, am I on the right track? Did I get it?
Yeah.
Well, all right. Is there more to that you'd like to share?
So it's interesting. As I'm on the other side of that, and we're just playing around here, and I appreciate doing this. This is fun. It feels to me like I'm in a therapy session. Like it does, like, which is relationship building, but it would feel, I'm wondering if I did this with a friend, if it comes off as not inauthentic. What am I looking for here? You know what I mean? Because you're just kind of really walking through the steps. Go, yeah, back to you.
Yeah, we get that. And I think that's a very natural response for people that are used to operating kind of monologically, right?
Hmm.
For thousands of years, human beings have talked at one another. And there's not an expectation that we go two-way, that we actually develop a dialogue. So if you're sharing this story with me and I actually ask you a little bit of this read back, this mirroring episode, for most people, it shocks them because we don't normally operate that way yet. We're hoping we help change that and we become a little bit more dialogic. And so if someone like you sense that, you might say, that's kind of a weird thing to say, or that's kind of an odd thing. I feel like, our conversation just got mechanical or
Yes.
stiff or fake or something.
Yeah.
And to that, I would say, I'm actually just practicing my listening. I'm trying to be a better listener. And so if you'll play along, that's something I'm trying to develop. But of course, if it doesn't feel right, then let's move through it. Let's move past it.
So let me play that back to you. You would say in the moment, if you feel an odd reaction, say, "Hey, just FYI, I just want to make sure I'm crystal clear on what you told me because I'm really practicing my listening here." So that vulnerability might offset the transactional feeling that someone might have had.
Absolutely. And the newness falls on my shoulders, not yours. I'm trying to say I'm the development project here and I'm taking a risk. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to grow, get better. And if it feels weird to you, I totally get it. It's a normal reaction.
But it's probably going to get better. So let's go back to that for a second. You'll still entertain me here, John, if that's okay. So you've said you ended that with, "Is there more to the story?" And okay, so I'm going to go back and say, or was that the second part? No, you want to say, "Did it get it right?" And I said,
Did I
"Yes."
get it? Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Accuracy
that's it.
second, and then curiosity third.
Which was, "Is there more to the story?"
Is there more? Yeah.
Right. And in this case, I would say, well, it seems to be ongoing. So that is the springboard. That is I like that that's a softening question. It feels that curiosity is now going to say, I like that question. It feels good, you know?
And that could go either way. It's not always going to lead to this depth of conversation because a lot of people will jump right in there and say, "Nope, you got it," because maybe they're sensing a little bit of awkwardness or
Yeah.
depth that they weren't ready for. And you actually still win in that situation. Of course, if the person gives you more and adds depth to understanding, that's a win. But just as important is if they say, "Nope, you got it," and they signal effectively that for right now, I've gone as deep as I'd like to go with you or with this subject. You walk away and they know that they were asked, that they had the opportunity to give you more if they wanted to. But
Right.
they also had the opportunity to slow things down and say, "No, that's okay for now."
That's really interesting. So my labeling technique would be like, wow, Jonathan, that sounds like a really rough day that you had. And that's kind of like, I put that in the bracket of tell me more, because you're going to react, say, yeah, it was hell, or it wasn't so bad. I mean, I don't know what you're going to say, but that's interesting.
I like your reaction too. And for somebody that is tuned to what you're thinking, they will take the bait. And
Right.
your kind of veiled interest is certainly genuine, and somebody might not interpret it as an invitation to go deeper. Some might. I think the three-dimensional mirroring actually makes it quite clear, and it allows more people to follow you in if they want to go there.
And what about, and I find I've tried to do this, and I'm curious your thoughts on whether this technique makes sense. But in some cases, if someone comes to me and they make a statement like that, and the conversation starts to go, and I'm trying to suss out. I don't want to feel transactional. So in work cases, I'll do this at the beginning of a conversation, or try to in some cases. But when it's personal, I might wait a little bit. Then I would interject with, "Look, Jonathan, look, I apologize for interrupting, but I just want to make sure I can be helpful. Like, are you looking, what would be helpful today? Is it that I just listen to you? You just want to rant? Is it that I provide, some objective opinion here on what I'm hearing, or that I give you some experience-based advice? Like, what would you like me to do? What would be helpful?" So what are your thoughts on that? And when does that come into play?
I love it. Somebody will never fail to tell you ultimately what they want. I
Right.
think where conversations sometimes go skewed left or right is when the listener tries to advance that and race to advice or race to solution. There's that expression that you've got an advice monster sitting on your shoulders that's just ready to leap into action.
I have five of
And
them, actually. I don't know if you saw them yet, but I have
five in your
six.
case. Well, you've got a lot of wisdom and a lot of things to share. I get it. Uh, Sometimes people are not quite ready for that, and they want to exhaust the depth of the scenario, context, needs, fears, ambitions before you offer advice or solutions, because they're only going to have to say, "Well, not in this case, that doesn't work, Ron. There are a couple more things to this that are relevant and specific and unique." And so saving them from have to kind of cut you off on the way to advice, or what you did was not add advice. You just asked the question. And I think your question was, "I'm just looking, how can I be most helpful?"
Choose
Which I
your own
think is a great
adventure.
question. Yep. And
Yeah.
I think that person can then say, "Well, tell you what, I want your advice, but give me 2 minutes because I want you to have the benefit of the entire situation." Or they could say, "Yeah, what are you thinking?"
Right.
And they might be ready for your solution. And so I don't think your question's a bad one. I think it fits. And in our structured dialogue that we teach and we coach, that question comes up every time in the natural flow of things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Really interesting. And I need to use that question more, which is there more? Right. I just think that it's a great question. It also is, it's more than just a curiosity question. On the other side, it lets you know how someone thinks. It lets you know their state of mind in some cases. There more is a springboard question. It's broad enough to give them the autonomy to answer in a way that fits them. It lets you know how they're thinking through the process, where it goes. Does it go to an emotional state of problem solving? I don't know. That's just a great question. Very thoughtful.
Yeah, and I can't take credit for that. That comes to me from the minds of two incredibly smart people, Dr. Helen LaKelly Hunt and Dr. Harville Hendricks. For 40 years, have been advancing the science of dialogue and conversations. And we've built a lot of our coaching practices on a lot of the smart things that they say.
Yeah, they've done a fantastic job with that, and it's simple, right? It's very simple, which I love.
Here's the thing. You mentioned simplicity, and it's one of my favorite words. It's what I endeavor to deliver because complexity kind of gets in a lot of people's way. So when we build learning systems, we try to make them simple. The problem with simple, though, is it shows up on the menu like a hamburger or, chicken Alfredo. Everybody sees it and they go, I know exactly what that is. I know what to expect. And I shoulder shrug and think I'm not that excited about it. The trick in adding simplicity is teaching them how these very simple things like dialogue and connection and relationship actually have levels of sophistication deep inside if you do them right. But if you set up a class and say, we're going to talk about communication, dialogue, connection, relationships, most people say, I already know what I need to know. There's very little you can teach me. And I think that's the challenge in this space. And perhaps some of the conversations and podcasts you do is actually scaling culture. Sounds like people go, I get it. Just be nicer to people, be more effective, and you'll have a better culture. And it's so much more complex and difficult that way, but you can't present it as difficult and complex. It has to be simplified.
Well, I agree, and it's interesting because when I think of my own communication skills, like there's different layers. Like the words are actually the simplest layer, if that makes sense from my perspective. Then it becomes tone, and then energy, and I'll mix in body language and energy. I just put those two together. That's complex, and understanding that and having this self-awareness. I mean, that's where I still trip up, is like, stopping myself. I'll sit on my hands just so I shut up because my hands are moving, my mouth's moving, and so trying to hack these systems. But it's the energy part. And I think that and again, I'd say think because I haven't taken many courses, certainly read books and listened to some podcasts on communication, but I don't hear a ton of like the energy tone or not. Or is that like, no, that's very common.
A lot of this conversation kind of stems out of 50-year-old research out of UCLA that actually sampled a range of communications and determined that only about 7% of a communicated message was actually the words used.
That's right.
And about 38%, so multiples of that, was actually vocal, not verbal, but vocal. Actually, the things you mentioned, volume,
Tone.
tone, intonation, energy, some of those things are 5 times more important. But most important of all, 55% of the message in this study revealed that it was
Oh yeah.
nonverbal, non-language cues, body position, eye contact, facial musculature. All these things were in a communicated message. So to your point about, it's so much more than just the words and the word choice. Communication is multidimensional. And I think you need to be aware of that when you set out to become a better communicator.
Yeah, I don't think that message is broad enough. Like, I heard that exact. It might have been off a point in I was at a YPO speaking kind of education day. This was 15 years ago. That's the only other time I heard that, other than you saying that right now, was that the opening speaker said that. So I don't know if I don't know if people know that.
It's clear to me that not enough people know that. When you go out and
Right.
have a conversation with 10 people, we put our time and effort into vocabulary, perhaps. And I think
Right.
most people misapply that. They then turn around and they write these long missives that are impossible to read, thinking that they're communicating well. When additional research says that ideal communication level should be eighth grade complexity. And you look at most college papers and they say, oh my gosh, that doesn't sound sophisticated enough. But it's actually the level which most people process best,
Right. Right. And you'd have to be so much more self-aware to do that, right? You really do.
for sure.
So talk to me about affirmation and leadership. What are your thoughts? How does it show up, and how do we do it right?
Affirmations in a leadership context is really one of a handful of tools that we coach for leaders and actually any employee or any person walking on the street to use to build psychological safety in a relationship. Affirmations is really pointing out the differences and the uniqueness of another person and then actually validating it and helping them understand that that is accepted, that without change, modification, or any kind of behavior shift, that the way they act and the things that they say are okay and that they're welcome in this space. That's affirmations. Affirmations is really probably a collection of activities. It's sharing appreciations with one another. It's actually offering to help somebody in a difficult task or in a difficult spot. It's also offers to connect. connecting exercise, to take time and actually go offline and actually spend some time getting to know one another. And the fourth aspect of that is really creating fun experiences that are fun in the eyes of the team or the other person that you're in a conversation with. All those things are a range of affirmation behaviors, but affirmations really serves to work with differences. And in a relationship context, too many new leaders are really coached to say, let's go ahead and coach out differences so we become more uniform, more homogenous, more same thinking, more same acting. And they're actually defeating the variety of skills and talents that make a team stronger. And actually, when you actually enhance the differences on a team and actually celebrate them with affirmations, people feel a little bit safer to act, in their own behavior. And, there's 10-year-old research from Google, Project Aristotle, that determined that the single most necessary ingredient for high performing teams is psychological safety. And so by using affirmations, you're actually promoting this environment where I am okay to act, say, and do the way I naturally act, say, and do. And that's how a leader can really promote safety and then actually pursue high performance with the affirmations tool belt, if you will.
So I want to make sure I get this right. So again, I can't mirror that, but I'm gonna play it back to you. So is that saying that, so if I show up at work and I'm behaving in a certain way, you're saying, look, Ron, that behavior is accepted here, but what if it's off? What if you don't agree with how I'm showing up? That's where I'm maybe.
Yeah, I think there's a misunderstanding that to build a psychologically safe culture, that it is absent or devoid of accountability, and it can't be. Because if you just said, I'm going to build a psychologically safe workplace or relationship, then it looks like a lounge. It looks like you can show up and do anything you want.
Right.
And that's not the case, right? You actually have to insert accountability at the same time. And with accountability, all that is stating that there are reasonable consequences for behavior that's out of expectation or out of standard or policy. And so in that case, if somebody does truly act and demonstrate unique behaviors that they want to hang on to, it's up to the leader to say, we love uniqueness, but we do have boundaries. And that behavior happens to be, beyond, expectation or policy.
Let
And
me
then I
let me
think
give
making that clear.
Yeah, let me give you a softer example of like that may be up for debate. And what I mean by that is, and I've noticed this lately, and I don't even know where this came back into where this message came back, but and I don't know if I read this or who was talking this lately, but it was this just the positioning of some people and how they communicate, where they are typically always the hero or the victim. So in this case, that's challenging. I find to work with someone that's always the hero of the story or they're the victim. And some people are always the victim of every day. What's going on? They're victim, victim, victim. And then some people are always the hero. And then there's people that play both. And geez, I've caught myself there a few times. And that's one that I find is more delicate because that's not one you'd say, look, we have a no hero policy here, right? How do you
Right.
how do you work through something like that? This is not aligned, it's not adding value. Talk me through that, how you see it.
In that case, if I had a team member or somebody on my team that was exhibiting that, I would start it with a conversation and start and asking them, how do you think that went? And seeing if there's any kind of self-awareness that is capable of picking up how the routine perception of you is you are always the star of the show. You always come through at the last minute. You always save a bunch of stupid, idiot, ignorant people from themselves. And see if they were actually aware that that perception was building or was felt. And then I
Can,
would
can
say,
you, Jonathan, sorry, can you tell me can you rephrase that question? So I've had a discussion with someone. Now I want to go there, but how do I phrase that to bring out that self-awareness? Because when you just said to me, how do you think that went? So that one might be too broad. I might just regurgitate what I told you about me being the hero again.
yeah. In that case, I would ask them, you know, how do you think it went? And kind of start to fish and
Mm.
explore for that self-awareness. If it was absent, if they said, I thought it went really well, I would actually ask them to say, how do you think the people in your audience felt today? How do you think the people in the audience felt in another story where if it hadn't been for you, the thing would have all imploded? And maybe start to suggest ways that their perception might not be the audience's perception and do it in a safe way. So they said, what you felt, maybe what you feel isn't wrong, but there's an open door. There's a possibility that people in your audience saw one more example of it being the you show. And I think in most cases, most people will at least open the conversation and say, "What are you talking about?" or "What are you getting at?" And they'll let me explore that.
Right. That's really interesting. I'm trying to think of also another question too, like you'd say to someone like, tell me about, so someone was the hero. Tell me how you saw yourself. Like it's just like kind of like what you're saying, pretty direct. How did you see yourself in that story? What role did you play? And see if they can from a self-awareness perspective, get there.
An even softer way is to say, lucky for us, you were there and you saved the day. If we were going to teach these skills, what would you kind of isolate as teachable skills we can share amongst the team so that if you're off that day on vacation, not feeling well, the team will still survive without your unique talents and attributes?
Got it. And what was the second part that you were going to on that?
Um,
I thought you were starting into a second piece. And sorry, I jumped in for a clarifying question there. So you were saying, ensuring that they were self-aware, but I thought there was a second part you were poking at.
I think and I don't know, your mind reading power is usually pretty good. So I'm trying to now rack my brain for the second thing that I was thinking about. But I might have said, offer up the opportunity to reveal self-awareness. And if it's not there, then you just have to softly find ways that aren't going to shut down the conversation saying, well, the team thinks you're a bit of a blowhard. The team is not happy with you, as happy as you are with yourself. I'd rather not go right there. I'd rather softly go into there and say, and find another way to do it, whether we talk about teachable skills that you've got or talk about the possibility that others on the team might be a little intimidated, at your success. And how do we share that around the team, delegate or other things?
Got it. Yeah, that's great. And I want to go to because I didn't understand this term, rationally competent. Can you talk to about rationally competent and bring that in from a leadership perspective, communication standpoint too?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the context I would have said it.
Yeah, so
uh,
so it talks about the benefits of becoming rationally competent for leaders, and
yeah,
how does this contribute to the overall success of the team? So in that perspective,
yeah, and in that case, we may be talking about a typo. Relationally competent is the term that we coach and use. If it showed up as rationally, then there's an L missing for a T, perhaps.
so Jonathan, just to let you know, that's me being dyslexic. I read the wrong word, so you're
Yeah, no worries.
it
I
says
really wanted to find a case where I've used rationally competent because it's a great expression. I'm just not familiar with it.
relationally. So it's funny because when I was going through this with Joel before the show, he was saying that, and I had to. This was a tongue twister. Even the word I had to repeat back to him, and I might have got it right. That's really funny. No, you're right. I read it wrong. Go.
Yeah, no worries. Relationally competent is a term we use and a skill we try to teach by helping people appreciate that it is not just a one-time thing. If a leader was hoping to build a range of high-quality relationships on their team, and they set about by saying, I've got 10 people on the team, I've got to build 10 great relationships with these 10 people, 10 individual relationships. But I can't just have a great conversation and then consider the relationship built. I actually have to maintain and support each of those relationships with a competency that says I'm willing to listen and I'm willing to spend time learning from you. I also need to affirm you periodically. I also need to welcome your differences periodically. And so there is a relational competency that is required of the best leaders that take a look at their relationships and say, I've got to maintain these over time. I can't just expect to have done it one time and sit back and enjoy the fruit of that labor.
And I would add to that because you're saying maintain, but I would also add just because I've been in that position is sometimes kind of an assessment of I'm not deep enough with Jonathan. I've got to, like then my maintenance, if 10 out of 10 is he'll share anything and is super comfortable, and one out of 10 is, we just nod at each other. I'm at a 6.5. I need to get to an 8. And so is that part of this as well?
It's absolutely a huge part of this. So probably 95% of most people's stress, anxiety, and worry at work lies in the space between their expectation and the outcome of the result. And far too often that gap is not discussed, either because the employee is not courageous enough to kind of invite a conversation about that gap, or the leader isn't proactive enough to say, hey, it's been a few weeks or it's been a few months since we've had a conversation. Let's talk about that. What are your expectations for what we do together, how we work together? But because that gap is not addressed and it's not spoken about, a lot of people fret over that gap and say, man, I'm not happy at work. I'm not getting what I'd like to, or even in a personal relationship. But yet I don't have the safety, the psychological safety to invite the question. My boss has never made it safe, or I don't have the courage to ask the question.
And what are your thoughts about that being in a cadence versus naturally, if you can be organized? And what I mean by that is I've kind of transitioned. I used to be a leader that would have a one-on or a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly meeting with everyone who reported to me, call it. And then one of our advisors, Holly Delaney, who came from Zappos, she kind of challenged me when I was writing the second book, Scaling Culture, actually. And she said, we've taken a different position of meeting people where they're at. Some people don't want to meet every week. And that relationship building or check-in is inauthentic. You're twiddling your thumbs and people cancel because there's nothing to say versus just the conversation of, Jonathan, how do you want this to go? And maybe that's more work related versus like, okay, I'm going to take you for lunch because we haven't seen each other for a long time. But what are your thoughts? Because it sounds like what you're saying isn't necessarily a hard cadence, or what's the best practice when it comes to that?
It's probably up to every individual leader. For me, it's not a hard cadence, and I think a lot of times this connectivity fails when it's kind of co-opted into a regular event. If it's forced on people, and that might be a weekly meeting, that might be a Zoom meeting where we're going to get together and have forced fun, or some other event. Maybe it's even a one-on-one coaching session where we're following an agenda, and I'm going down the list and I say, "Okay, Ron, here's the part where I ask you, how's everything going at home?" And you say, "Well, gosh, this feels fake and synthetic. I'm not really ready to open up here." And so I love the idea of leaders reminding themselves that connection is a cadence, but I like it to be a little less forced, a little less programmatic, and make it routine and regular, but not at the same time and place every week or every day, even to kind of make it float around the week's work, but actually commit to making it happen in some way.
Mm.
So, yes and no, I guess, is the long answer to your short question.
No, I got it. And I also think one thing that you pointed out there, which is you said different place. I think that, and maybe I overthink this stuff, but I think that's so important. If you're back to I need to build a relationship with Jonathan, I'm at 6, I need to get to an 8, and I've made some type of assessment on our how deep our relationship is. And I always say, be careful of home court advantage, which means you come to my office, sit across my desk. I mean, that is like you're just going to come in crossing your arms. Like there's no way. Versus like, hey, Jonathan, what's your favorite coffee shop? Where do you like to, what's your favorite lunch place? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great thought. Home court advantage works against you as much as it does for you. And the same is true about finding a neutral third space. Starbucks made their fortune on building a third space that wasn't home, that wasn't work. It was somewhere else that people felt they could go and be safe. And so at work, the same is true. If I only conduct meetings in my office and I happen to be the boss, there is a home court that is very intimidating for the people in your audience. But you also can't turn it around and try to go on the road exclusively either, because if I do the drive-by and I stop by someone's desk while they're working in the middle of something and say, "Hey, I've got something really important to tell you. Let me know when that works," you're going to risk paralyzing the person with worry now because you've actually worked in their space, maybe even unexpectedly. So I love the idea of this third space that you just mentioned about having these conversations at a variety of places that don't feel like home field advantage.
And I'll add, not just the drop in on location, but it's drop in on message. Like if I say, "Hey, Jonathan, I want to meet you at 3 o'clock tomorrow to go through a few things," you're like, "Oh my God, I'm going to lose my job." So, and by the way, I'm assuming that, but because I've been on the receiving end of someone's paranoia, and I've said, "God, I got to stop doing that." "Hey, Jonathan, I've got some fantastic feedback that I think will really be helpful. And I want to talk about a few other key things that I also think you'll be excited about tomorrow, 3 o'clock." Very different.
And I've gotten a ton of those emails, and I probably wrote a few of those emails on a Friday afternoon also, where I said something huge, first thing on Monday, let's talk, and leave it at that. And I've ruined at least a weekend on behalf of this person who read the email. And after you get a couple of those, you stop sending them because you're like, I've got to either clarify what I'm talking about or put in a sentence there that says, "Just great news. Looking forward to sharing something fantastic, something." Or if it
Correct.
is important, let the cat out of the bag and let them know, we'll solve it, but we do need to address it early in the week, something.
Right. 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 Yeah. Because you don't want the trap, gotcha. Hey, you weren't prepared at all. I agree. There's a delicate balance. Jonathan, before we wrap, what else are you working on? What's the latest and greatest, interesting, or biggest challenge that we haven't talked about today?
I think there's a couple of them. I appreciate the question. I think there is such a predominant desire in workspaces today to build a performance culture, a high performance culture, that not enough attention is being paid to actually building a kind of a coincident learning culture beside it. And we don't really do a lot with learning. We don't really play enough in that space to say we've made mistakes and here are our lessons learned. And so while results matter, and obviously companies have to perform, if they perform at the expense of learning, then a company or an organization has a huge cultural problem. And so that's one of the things that excites me is really promoting this learning culture to sit up within a high performing culture. The other thing I think I'll just leave you with one other thing is this idea that management and leadership are two mutually exclusive skill sets that professional workspaces have to pursue. And in too many cases, companies kind of consider management as really just low stakes leadership. And management is the intro to the graduate course, which is leadership to follow. And what I really like to challenge companies to think about is saying you actually have to build both of these skill sets at the same time. And it's not really senior, junior, or advanced or beginner. What it really is management is the fulfillment of stasis, existing conditions, existing goals that are working, that are meeting the expectation. Management fulfills steady state. Leadership fulfills change. And if a company is built right, they will be actually capable of performing both functions at the same time and not waiting to teach a mid-level manager how to be a good leader until at the end or the sunset of their career, but doing it early in life. Those are a couple of things we're working on. We get really excited about.
And just a clarifying question on that, because we're going through this exercise right now to build our leadership tenets and what does leadership mean here at Vita, right? Because leadership is, and I love, I actually really enjoyed Marcus Buckingham and Ashley Goodall's 9 Lives About Work, where they said leadership's not a thing, it's spiky. Donald Trump is a leader. Some Taekwondo instructor's a leader, and people lead, they fall over someone's spikiness in something. And I thought that was really interesting because it was the first time I had heard that word challenge. You typically, so servant leadership's one thing, passive aggressive command control is another type of leadership, and so well, one thing we were thinking about, I'm curious your take on this, Jonathan, is and I think this pairs with what you were saying, but the breakdown of, so if we had 4 tendencies to say, here's kind of a starting point, almost like Jim Collins level 1 to level 5, or I don't forget those levels, but there's a starting point and then introducing those points. Is that kind of what you're saying? Or is it just, it's all or nothing here? You've got to get to the holy grail of leadership here.
100%. It is a continuum or a range. And it's not just a switch that you flip and now you are a competent, qualified leader. You're always adding those lessons. You're always observing from other capable leaders. And you probably should be reminded that you are a leader today. All of us are leading aspects of our lives. And it's oftentimes that your responsibilities grow, your command grows. You have to prepare yourself for that because you can't wait 10 years and now say, you're in a leadership role now. So now's the first time you'll dust off your leadership skills and try them out.
Great
And
point.
so it is very important to what you said, which is just leadership is additive, iterative, and you're always adding these lessons incrementally.
Jonathan, it's been a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed this. You're obviously passionate and an expert at communication, and you're spreading the good word and showing folks some great tools. And I hope that today's podcast added to that. And so thanks for sharing. Thanks for stopping in.
Thanks for having me on, Ron. I've enjoyed it.
For more information about Dr. Jonathan Thorp and his work, please visit safeconversations.com. To learn more about our books or our Scaling Culture Masterclass on building resilient, high-performing teams, please visit scalingculture.org. And lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a comment and share the podcast with a friend or colleague. We'll be back soon with another incredible guest.